Hello, it's my pleasure to be with you today. My name is Valerian Bernard. I'm with the Brahma Kumaris, and I am also with the Geneva Interfaith Forum on Climate Change, Environment, and Human Rights, the GIF, who organized this webinar. I would like to also wish all of you a happy Human Rights Day because today, 10th of December, is Human Rights Day. So, welcome to all of you to this COP26 Outcomes GIF Debriefing webinar. And today we will have different panelists in this conversation on the COP26 with different perspectives, focusing especially on the interfaith action, the human rights, the loss and damage, and the climate finance, with the particular focus on the green energy and on the green climate front. I'm really sorry. So our panelists today are Mr. BKWSU, who is a loss and damage lead negotiator for the G77 in China. We have Ms. Amanda Krohn from OHCHR. She is a specialist on human rights and climate change. We also have Ms. Alexandra Gusen-Ishii. She is the Soka Gakkai International UN rep, as well as one of the GIF members. And we also will have very soon with us, hopefully, Eileen Mairena, who is an active observer of the UNFCCC Green Climate Fund for the indigenous peoples. So without further ado, I would like to give our first panelists the conversation on what do you think can be done to enable multilateral cooperation that is responsive enough to the needs of those vulnerable to climate change? And could you share with us what the most significant challenges you met during the Glasgow negotiations, as well as some of the victories you obtained? You are one of the lead negotiators for G77 in China, so you must have had many adventures. So please, Vice, as your friends call you, may I call you Vice? Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I wasn't very sure whether I needed to prepare a PowerPoint or not, but I did prepare a PowerPoint. So, but maybe for the purposes of our conversation, maybe I should not do that presentation.
Look, if you would like to show it, I can make you, I can enable you to do that. If you just want to speak to it, that's fine. Tell me what you prefer.
Okay, so maybe actually that might be better. Let me, if you can make me co-host, then I can put it up on screen, and then so I can.
I'll make you.
Sometimes it's better that way. It's not too many. It's
okay.
Not that long. Yeah.
Okay, great. So here you are. You are already a co-host.
Okay, so let me just put it up.
Go ahead.
Can you see it?
It's coming. It is there now. We can see it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So so let me just again quickly thank you for inviting me to be here, and thank you to Julius for thinking of me and for purposes of giving you this briefing.
Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
It's a big difference to have you with us.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. My take on COP26 really comes from sort of like what you were saying, Valerian. Sort of like what my involvement has been in the COPs over the past maybe 15 years or so. And that has been largely in terms of being an advisor and oftentimes a negotiator for developing countries. And so these are just some of the countries that I have had the privilege of representing, and some of the groups that I have worked with there, including the Group of 77 in China. Um, and this was largely in the context in the past of my work until at least 2019 with the South Center. I left that organization already, and so now I'm working with civil society again, including the Third World Network. So COP was really quite an interesting experience, very much different, but at the same time very much similar to what we had in the previous COPs up to Madrid. Lots of people, all of us, of course, now wearing masks, and Glasgow is still very wet. And I think what we saw there is still the typical dynamics of COP, where you have last minute huddles, last minute discussions, just trying to do some breakthrough. And so I think, just to respond to your first question, Valerian, and then maybe I'll go through the rest of the presentation as well. I think one of the biggest challenges that one can see in the Glasgow and even beyond Glasgow was the fact that there really was a significant level of structural power inequity between the developed countries and the developing countries. And my engagement in it has been not just in the context of the G77, but also in the context of the work that I've done in the past, which was that one can clearly see that the developed countries do have clearly defined economic and political objectives. They have a common narrative that is being supported by the UK's presidency. And what among these objectives were, they really wanted to see a shift away from the traditional principle in the climate regime of common but differentiated responsibility, this acronym here, CBDR, to an idea of shared responsibility, where we forget historical responsibility, we forget the idea that, and the fact that it was developed countries, when they themselves were developing and colonized the global South, that a huge part of the greenhouse gases that are now currently up in the atmosphere was because of that kind of development. We also saw developed countries pushing forward a very strong mitigation orientation in terms of what the outcome should be, and downplaying as much as they could adaptation and loss and damage and climate finance. And I think the idea here really is that there is a long game that is being played here for economic and political dominance, continued economic and political dominance. Whereas for the global South, we had quite disparate narratives. There were, although we did have strong messages on adaptation and climate finance and loss and damage, I think there's a great deal of work that still needs to be done among developing countries to do it. And that actually, I think, reflects itself in terms of how many of the developing countries approach climate negotiations. So you do have some countries that are really quite active. You have some that are more focused on their own needs. You have some that have decided to just simply play along, and there are some who just have decided, well, we'll just float wherever the current takes us. So in terms of the most contentious issues for developing countries during COP26, I think there are like these four here. One is adaptation, and there was a really strong push to have a global goal on adaptation discussions taking place. Push for adaptation finance. We talked about loss and damage a lot, including the creation of a loss and damage fund. We talked about climate finance, including accountability of developed countries for failing to meet the $100 billion by 2020 goal. And we talked a lot about the flexibility in climate action reporting. So I think a lot of those things were really contentious in the sense that developed countries did not want many of these things, and we're trying their best to avoid it in favor of focusing more on a mitigation-oriented approach to the outcome of the negotiations. And so this is how I see the outcome of COP26 looking like. I think both above it and around it, we have this big discussion about what the global economy should look like over the next 15, 20, 30 years, which is actually shaping a lot of the discourse in the climate negotiations. And that has found itself reflected, for example, in two types of outcomes coming from COP26. One, you have a negotiated set of outcomes, and another one, you have a non-negotiated set of outcomes. So the negotiated set of outcomes were those of us those of us who were there as negotiators were trying to negotiate. So that included, for example, this global climate goal on mitigation. This 45% below 2010 by 2030. Those references to phase down of unabated coal and phase out of fossil fuel subsidies. All of those things were among those that were negotiated. And then, of course, you had those negotiations on guidance for cooperation, so on finance, on technology and loss and damage. There was a set of negotiated outcomes on the implementing rules. So what would reporting look like on carbon trading? And then there was a big push by the UK presidency to have a set of non-negotiated outcomes. And these were essentially external statements or declarations, not official, not negotiated by negotiators, but really more about statements of intent, if you will, from mostly developed countries talking about their initiatives on adaptation, forest, land use, aviation, product efficiency, energy transition, and all that. And what I take from these two sets of outcomes, really coming from COP26, is that we are seeing a shift in terms of the climate regime becoming one of putting in place markers as to what the focus would be over the next 10 years. And that would be focusing on the use of technology, for example, on the much heightened role of private sector and capital in terms of being a primary quote-unquote mitigation actor, which then actually enhances the role of corporations and the profit-seeking approach for mitigation primarily, and not so much on adaptation, not so much in climate finance. And I think that is a big concern for especially for me and for, I think, for many developing countries, because what that most likely will entail will be a situation in which we have over the next 10 years a much greater focus on mitigation because those will be rules that will be implemented. And then for the issues that developing countries hold dear to their hearts, and which many poor communities will also find more interesting or relevant as well, such as adaptation, such as finance or loss and damage, most of those will become just the subject of talk shops in COP27, COP28, whereas the mitigation part of the regime will be more about implementation and action. But then those implementation and action would be done not so much through the public sector, but really through the private sector, in which case then the focus will then be on technology, which could then have an implication in terms of what kind of regime that will be set up. And I'm taking this approach largely because after COP26, when I got back to Geneva, I got into with the organizations I'm working with into a bit of detail in terms of working with developing countries here in Geneva in the context of the WTO ministerial conference. And there, I think we see a lot of these more trade-related initiatives coming in play in the WTO, where there's a lot of talk about trade and environment sustainability, about about environmental goods. And I think the concern there is what we are seeing is on two things, right? One is that with all of these things coming out from COP26, from the WTO, from all of the discussion about finance, private sector finance, product efficiency, energy efficiency, technology, energy transition, and all that. What we're seeing would be a two-level game taking place. One is that there's a much greater focus on technology and market economy mechanisms that will be the primary means for through which mitigation would be undertaken. And because of that, we're not sure actually whether the sufficient scale of emission reductions will actually take place, and that's where a bulk of the money will go. And then on the second level, you will have many developing countries, especially the least developed countries, doing their best to try to finance themselves adaptation, loss and damage, and structural economic diversification, which means that much of the profits for mitigation reductions will go here, with much of the technology already being owned and controlled and traded by developed countries, then harvesting those profits. And then much of the expenditure in terms of the public budget, much of the effort in terms of doing adaptation will have to be shouldered with minimal international support by developing countries. And we will see that playing out over the next 10 years in terms of this kind of like framing, I think, over this whole climate/economy context, where there's a big play in terms of market economy related conflicts or competition, and then with many developing countries sort of like leaving this ground to the bigger developing countries, and many developing countries just trying to focus more on whatever they can do to address loss and damage and adaptation. And that might be the way in which we see over the next 10 years the impacts of COP26 working out. And this is just a way to just like highlight that direction of travel, where you see, for example, on the left, if we have a clearly focus on mitigation that is very technology centric, and that's not community based, for example, we will see a lot of that focus coming in play in terms of technology, which then actually enhances the role of the global trading regime, investment regime, which enhances the role of corporations. And on the other hand, you will have many developing countries trying to spend scarce public resources on adaptation and loss and damage, because they will not get too much of that resources from the international arena. This is just a slide to highlight why I think a technology-focused mitigation approach will benefit developed countries more, and that's largely because most of the patents for these kinds of technologies are owned in developed countries, and most of the exporters of these are developed countries. So what might we be seeing as coming out from COP26, going to COP27, maybe COP28, over until 2030? We have two possible world futures. One is where we're trying to see if the SDGs can be achieved, and one where a possibility that inequalities are intensified, right? And my concern is that if we are heading towards a world where inequalities are intensified, we might end up with a two-speed world again, like what we currently have, instead of a better world where you have developed countries and pockets in many developing countries that are high technology, capital intensive, with high levels of adaptive capacity, and then developing countries broadly, and then huge areas of developing countries that are still low value added, very much poor and emissions intensive, with large numbers of climate impact vulnerable populations. So going towards COP27, I think we still have to push this for developing countries to try to shift the approach away from mitigation and focus it more on adaptation, on loss and damage, and climate finance, so that when we think about what we should be trying to do to get multilateral cooperation in place, we should really be thinking that, adaptation, loss and damage, and climate finance are indicators of creating a focus on equity and fairness, on being able to hold developed countries accountable, and making sure that the often false solutions that would be pushed by technologies on mitigation then do not become the center of attention, but rather the center of attention should be on people power, on community organizing, so that the developing countries are able to get power.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much, Vice. Looking forward to having more of a conversation with you. I would like to hear more about your victories, but for now, I would like to hear Amanda. Amanda Kron works with the Office of the High Commissioner in Geneva, and she is going to talk to us on how do you evaluate the outcomes of COP26, in particular from the human rights perspectives, and explain us how is this taking place in your mind, because you really are a specialist on this topic. So the word is yours. Do you need to be made a co-host? Do you also have a presentation?
No, thank you, Valerian, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the event today.
We are very happy that you're here, Amanda, and you were with us in the Interfaith Talanoa dialogue. So you've been a friend over time. So thank you.
No, thank you. And as Valerian mentioned, I'm with the UN Human Rights Office, working for their Environment and Climate Change team. And it's a particular delight to be with you to talk about climate change and human rights on Human Rights Day, as Valerian mentioned earlier during our conversation as well. So starting out with some of the reflections about COP26 from a human rights perspective, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights was deeply engaged, first of all, throughout the negotiations at COP26, and we were participating to encourage inclusion of human rights and human rights-based approaches, including in the COP26 outcomes. And priority areas in this work going into COP26 included enhanced ambition, work relating to Article 6, which has also been referenced by previous speakers, participation, and in that context also the Action for Climate Empowerment Agenda, loss and damage, and climate finance. And the High Commissioner herself also issued a dedicated statement in advance of COP26 calling for rights-based climate action. So the ultimate COP26 outcome includes several positive elements, including language on human rights and rights of indigenous peoples in both preambular and operative text of the guidelines for Article 6. There are also references to the important role of civil society and non-party stakeholders. There is emphasis and actions to promote empowerment and engagement of youth in UNFCCC processes. And there's integration of human rights language from the Paris Agreement and the Paris Agreement preamble in the Glasgow Climate Pact or the cover decision, as well as a call that the implementation of the new Glasgow work programme on action for climate empowerment must be implemented, respecting, promoting, and considering obligations on human rights and gender equality. However, the COP did not reach strong outcomes with respect to loss and damage and climate financing, nor did it make a clear call for higher ambition, including as relating to fossil fuels. And there were also several concerns raised regarding participation in advance of and during the COP, including by special procedure mandate holders as well. Of course, under the Paris Agreement, and as has been referenced previously as well, states have agreed to respect, promote, and consider the respective obligations on human rights when taking climate action. And this commitment was then reiterated in the Glasgow Climate Pact and should continue to inform climate action going forward. You had also referenced in the questions posed in preparation for this event the relationship to the recently approved Human Rights Council mandate on human rights and climate change. And of course, even though the Human Rights Council decisions on the right to healthy environment or to the new mandate on climate change and human rights, even though they were not explicitly mentioned in the cover decision, for which there would have been a precedent following the Cancun agreements in 2010, which referred to Resolution 10.4 of the Human Rights Council on human rights and climate change. There was nonetheless a lot of discussion on human rights, inclusion and participation during the negotiations, at side events, and also in press conferences. And importantly, the conference also included discussion on access to information, participation, and education, including, of course, in the context of ACE, or the Action for Climate Empowerment. And these elements in themselves are also human rights. There was also a lot of discussion about the relationship between climate change and biodiversity, other environmental processes and events, such as Stockholm +50, UNCCD, and CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as in general references to policy coherence with other processes and standards. And I think in this context, integrating a human rights-based approach in all environmental and climate action, including the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and ensuring this policy coherence will be an important element in the lead up to COP27. And a potential engagement on the right healthy environment by the General Assembly, as referenced in the Human Rights Council Resolution 4813 on the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, as well as the appointment of the Special Rapporteur on climate change and human rights, are developments that could further strengthen efforts to promote coherence, particularly as relates to climate change and human rights. So I think I will stop here in the interest of time, but very happy to continue discussing and looking forward to the continuation of the event. Thanks so much, Valeria.
Thank you so much for your enlightening presentation, Amanda. I think understanding both the presence of the human rights and the climate change within the conferences is really something very important. And what Vice presented also around the gap between poorer and richer countries getting bigger and bigger is also something very important to understand. Now it's my pleasure to present Alexandra. Alexandra is with Soka Gakkai, and she is also one of the GIF members. So it's really great that you could be with us today. It is my pleasure to be conversing with you. I would also like all the people who are watching on Zoom to know that we have some people monitoring the chat. So please feel free to ask questions, and we will then be able that way to communicate your concerns, interests, and questions to our panelists. Also, Alexandra has been very active on the ACE, so the Action for Climate Empowerment. And I know that it wasn't an easy task. You really was so active on it. And the GIF is always looking at the whole topic of climate change as part of our interest. So please do let us know how you have been working and what are the highlights of your work regarding Article 6 and the ACE, and how do you evaluate the outcomes Are you satisfied? Could you explain us why you are or why you're not?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Valerian. Thank you, Vice. Thank you, Amanda, for, I think it's been very complimentary to have your two perspectives from really different outlooks on the outcome of the conference that really enables to have a better understanding. And so I feel that I'm going to take out of what Amanda put forward and explain, I'm going to kind of do a little zoom in on the ACE part. And so I was following this part of the negotiation specifically, which relate to, so it's called Action for Climate Empowerment. It is a smaller part of the convention inside the UNFCCC. And it's really relating to, as Amanda mentioned, to participation. So it has 6 pillars that relate to participation and education training. So climate change education training, public awareness, public participation, and public access to information. And so some of these pillars are actually also, as mentioned, really human rights, internationally recognized human rights. And at the beginning, so this year was important because they were going to, they did adopt the new 10-year work program for Action for Climate Empowerment. And so to zoom in a little bit in the negotiations, at the beginning in the text that was proposed for negotiation, the rights-based language was included. And then throughout the negotiations, it got removed. And the possibility to participate for civil society and observers, we could start at the beginning to, the very beginning was very hard to access because there was the World Leaders Summit at the same time. So only very few could enter the room of the negotiations. Others had to follow on the virtual platform, which was glitching, so very difficult to follow. But somehow through the discussions with various delegations as the negotiations were progressing, we understood that rights-based approach was important to several delegations, but at the same time, we could not be observing the whole process itself. And what happened was at the very end, so the last evening, after many days, people were tired too, the very end of the negotiations, when the draft text came, then the rights-based language had been removed. From the guiding principles that would guide this work for the next 10 years, for this work program. And what was, I feel, interesting for me, also a learning experience in a way, was that it was a mix of many things that led to that result. And it was a big disappointment for civil society, for some states too. To the extent that it almost became possible or precedent to almost reopen the language during the meeting of where the decision was going to be adopted and was adopted. In the end, it was not reopened, but several states really took the floor, starting with Mexico, and then 13 other states after that apologized for not having the rights language included, and really said it was crucial. And what's interesting, and where I learned, and where I feel that also then the work of United Civil Society together, also together with Amanda's work and OHCHR, and I mean also states. So I am taking this kind of like disappointment and using it as fuel for really further action to make sure that human rights would then really not be disregarded in other areas of the convention that are crucial, such as Article 6, as was discussed. And then there were some then significant wins, or like at least important steps, definitely not enough, but important steps as described by Amanda. And one maybe that I can mention, in addition to what Amanda laid out, is maybe that in the Article 6 on the rules for the carbon trading markets, they have agreed, established, but not the details of it, so it's still very up in the air, but they have agreed and established an independent grievance mechanism to which, so there are still no details, but that should be established to hear grievance in the context of Article 6, so in the context of carbon trading. And for instance, this independent grievance mechanism went through many phases itself, and in the last 24 hours, before the last 24 hours, it was not independent anymore. It was a grievance mechanism, so that would have probably been under the convention. But in the last 24 hours, it was really regained to have it independent, so that it can be established in text that it would be independent. So it's maybe points of detail in a way, but that are important and that were part of like a momentum that probably did like a roller coaster to some extent, with some losses, some wins. So I feel that right now, it really, Amanda mentioned that for the specific issue of ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment, states will have to design an action plan with activities. And so I feel now it's also up to civil society to really continue engaging and reaching out and observing and scrutinizing and really bringing these issues so that it can become really a norm, an overarching norm, that it becomes truly embodied and accepted, that intersecting link between human rights and climate change. I think I'm going to stop here as well. Looking forward to engaging in the conversation and also discussing, I guess, the next steps towards the future in COP27. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your passion, and it's true that you were so active at the COP. You really were an inspiration for many, and I can see that we really went from the macro with Vice to the micro with you, like the micro negotiations and the you know, the little big work that has to be done on the floor as well. So thank you so much. We have also another panelist that hasn't been able to join us. She is a Miskito indigenous person living in Nicaragua. I know, because I lived there, that internet is not always an easy thing to have, so I still hope that she could join us. She worked on the Green Climate Fund, and we were really looking forward to her participation as well. Don't forget, all of you who are following on YouTube, that you are able to ask questions, and we do have two colleagues, Elena Cedillo from LWF, and also Tena Peralta from WCC, who are monitoring the questions and who will pass them on to us. So do not hesitate to ask questions. Amanda wrote to me because she does unfortunately have a next meeting starting at 2. So maybe my first question will go to you, Amanda, if that's okay with you. I look forward to, like all of us who are working on climate change, we already need to prepare for the COP27. And so it's interesting to know, what do you think are the main opportunities and obstacles in making sure that everything we need to happens at COP27? And in this, maybe if you could also add something on the role of faith-based organizations work, because as you know, the Geneva Interfaith Forum is an interfaith forum. So the word is yours, Amanda. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Valerian, and thank you also to the other speakers for all of the very interesting remarks, and apologies also for having to leave a little bit early. I think next year, of course, will be a very important year for climate action and integrating human rights and environmental and climate governance, both in the context of the UNFCCC, and that of course also includes the global stocktake as one such opportunity. And there will of course also be continued work, as referenced by Alexandra in her remarks as well, on action for climate empowerment, on climate finance, on loss and damage, and other issues. And in relation to action for climate empowerment, this has already been referenced by Alexandra, I believe, but of course the fact that the Glasgow Climate Pact urges states to take a rights-based and gender-sensitive approach in the implementation of the Glasgow Work Programme on action for climate empowerment is critical there. I think also going back a little bit to the point that I referenced earlier on policy coherence, I think that this is also significant when it comes both to the two recent resolutions by the Human Rights Council on the right to healthy environment, the new mandate for the Special Rapporteur, but also in relation to environmental governance within other spheres. And 2022 will include, as you know as well, several important milestones where rights-based and participatory action will be really critical. And that includes the second part of the United Nations Environment Assembly. It includes the Conference of the Parties under the UNCCD. And it also includes the CBD COP, the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Stockholm +50 meetings. So there are a lot of environmental governance meetings and processes more generally happening next year, where it will be important to ensure coherence and a rights-based approach across those processes as well. I think also it's perhaps important to reflect on in this context that human rights and the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and also the protection of environmental human rights defenders, will be a critical component of this work. It's also recognized, in addition to being recognized in a number of national and regional legislation and jurisprudence, it's also recognized in the Secretary General's call to action for human rights, as well as in the report Our Common Agenda, in which the Secretary General has outlined his vision for the next 25 years. So wanted to make that connection here as well.
There is a question that also are starting to pour from the YouTube. So what you're saying is really interesting, but I would like the people who are present and who make the effort to ask questions to feel that they are getting answers. So we have questions for Vice, but we have one that maybe you could also address, Amanda. What can faith communities do to reduce the impact of materialistic, profit-driven consumer economy that is blocking climate justice, and how to address the lack of respect of human rights when it comes to climate refugees, like the example of Venezuela, in Trinidad and Tobago. So in your designing the response you were already giving, maybe you could include a bit of that. Thank you.
Of course, my pleasure, and thank you also to the participants who are engaging and asking questions. And I think actually that links in quite well with one of the points that I was going to link back to UNEA, the UN Environment Assembly, and other frameworks, where there has, of course, been a strong interfaith component and interfaith work as well. And I think that's, of course, also something that we're seeing in the climate change at the COPs. But I think it's also interesting to see how the interfaith engagement, including on relation to climate change and human rights, but also to environment and human rights more broadly, is being woven together across these different processes. on human mobility, refugees, internally displaced persons, etc. There is, of course, under the climate regime, there's a dedicated task force on displacement, which sits under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. OHCHR is an ad hoc member of the task force as of earlier this year. So we're very delighted to continue to engage in that sphere on the linkages between climate change, human rights, and human mobility as well. Just one sort of snapshot, because at the COP as well, we released a report focusing on climate change, human rights, and migration in the Sahel. So very happy to share that with you, Valerian, for further sharing with interested participants as well. And that,
yes, please do, Amanda. Thank you.
And I also wanted to mention, of course, as climate change impacts a number of human rights and a wide array of rights, including the right to life, right to water, etc. Of course, right to development is also one of those critical rights. And I think that ties in to some of the points that were made earlier by Weiss as well. So thanks again, Valerian.
Well, thanks a lot, Amanda. I can see that this conversation is really something really that could go on. There is so much to discuss, so much to move forward in these topics. Maybe we could go to Weiss now for the different questions that have been asked to him, if that's okay with you, Weiss. One of the questions that we have for you reads like this. Thank you for the fascinating presentation from Yves Lador. The first question would be, why are you not advocating for an alternative narrative on mitigation, which impacts the poorest first? And why keep describing the central divide as just north and south, when a wide number of leaders in the south policies continue to threaten their own population, starting with the most vulnerable segments? And of course, also, we would be very interested to have your take on the role of interfaith action into all the different things that we have been talking about today. The word is yours, Weiss.
Thank you, Valerian, and thank you to Eve for that very interesting question. I think the narrative that one has to look at really here is really the narrative of equity. And when you ask why am I not advocating an alternative narrative, I mean that is precisely what we have been trying to do, at least in terms of my work, which is a narrative of looking at how do we achieve equitable outcomes in these negotiations that reflect and that respond to the needs of developing countries and the especially the poorest communities that are in developing countries. I think it is quite important that we do not forget the historical aspects of the problem of climate change that we have before us, because it's only when we recognize the impact of those historical aspects, that gave rise to the problem of climate change, that we then would be able to lay down the solutions for what would be an equitable transition moving forward. And that means that we have to really look at what has been, we have to look at it still in a way where one differentiates between developed and developing countries. And we cannot and we should not move away from that discourse, because that is where equity will lie as moving forward. Second is that we do know that when we talk about moving forward, it is not as if all the blame has to be on developed countries, and developing countries are largely blameless. I think we all recognize that much of the work that needs to be done on climate change has to be done in developing countries as well. And that means that developing country governments have a singular responsibility to their peoples to do that work as well. But at the same time, we must insist, I think, on the accountability of developed country governments to live up to what they had committed to over the past 30 years, and to recognize the historical responsibility that they have for this. And that is where I think faith-based organizations and networks such as the GIF would come in, because the transition towards a world that addresses the concerns of the poorest and most vulnerable among us, including those that are in the big developing countries where most of the world's poor actually live in, can only be addressed by looking at what is that essence of faith, right? And that and if we look at what is the essence of faith, essence of faith in most of the world's, in virtually in all of the world's religions, is this essence of justice, of fairness, of equity that is deeply embedded, of being able to treat each other as equals, of being able to respect each other as fellow human beings and fellow travelers on this earth. And so I think that narrative has to be there, and that narrative is about equity, about transitioning to a better world. And that means that equity has to be spread across the board in terms of what kind of policies do we agree to at the climate regime. Is it policies that will enhance the power of transnational corporations? Maybe not. Or should it be policies and approaches and guidance that would enhance the ability of local governments to work together together with their national governments on adaptation, on addressing loss and damage, on making sure that you have a rights-based approach. And maybe that is where that narrative has to go to. But the problem is, which I was pointing out in my presentation, is that when you hit the negotiations, when you go to the negotiations, the dynamics there are such that a lot of the focus is on emission reductions. And when you talk about emission reductions without the big context, without historical responsibility, without equity, without understanding why you need to talk about developed and developing countries as not being on the same footing, then we head into a regime where existing inequities become intensified and become enhanced. And I think that is not equitable. And so I think that alternative has to be the alternative narrative has to be about equity, about justice moving forward, and that applies across the board. And if we can use the rights-based approach for that, then let's use the rights-based approach for that. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there are certain development aspects and development circumstances that need to be reflected in order for equity to be properly reflected. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation and your answer. I fully agree with you. Faith and justice are fully connected, and I think that we really need to be aware of that when we do our work. And I think we, in a sense, have a moral authority also to speak to countries and remind them of their moral responsibilities and their historical responsibilities. So thank you for your answers. I would like now to ask my friend and colleague also, Alexandra, a question regarding the future of the COP27. Could you tell us a little bit how you see the interfaith community work together in order to address climate justice, in order to address human rights issues during the COP27? Can you share your vision or a bit of the agenda that you can see we have ahead of us?
Thanks very much. And thanks, Amanda left, but thanks, Vice, for, I learned a lot from everything you shared. From the interfaith perspective, I feel that towards COP27, and it's based, I feel also on the engagement and experiences I got from COP26. I really feel that there is this role of bringing people together and of creating a sense of community that in effect really enables to go beyond the divides that we have from the political side in many respects. So I feel that there is like this community building and needs to continue to happen from the interfaith perspective. I think for many of the faith movement engaged in COP26, whether it was in Glasgow or whether it was remote, there was a true sense of really solidarity and compassion. So that, and of really addressing the narrative of climate justice at the center. So that was really uplifting. There is, I feel so, a sense of addressing the individual at the individual level, of enabling to really shift our own narratives and to be also very aware and take responsibility at our individual level, and then really at a global level to be able to have like stronger voices so that the narrative can shift. And so, for instance, I was inspired by the fact that the Interfaith Liaison Committee could deliver yet again the results of this big dialogue, the Talanoa dialogue, that gathered many people, and that where different groups, faith groups, could really gather, discuss, and bring out some outcomes that became a call. And that was really delivered to the Deputy Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. So there is this action at that level. There is a gathering with the local faith communities where the COP is taking place, and to really learn from and create something together. And so then to be able to really reach out. And I was particularly impressed by the UK-based faith coalitions, because I really learned from them the fact that they kind of like scoped what would be the main issues at this COP. And then they really went into what relates to justice and climate justice, and they went deep dive into the issue of loss and damage, and really realized that this is one of the issues that is absolutely necessary to advocate for and fight for in terms of embodying climate justice. Not the only one, but one important, and others really relate to divesting from fossil fuel. And what was inspiring to me was that they had a process, and I myself had this, but they had a process where they really educated themselves. That's what they shared, really educated themselves into these historical responsibilities as well. And then as civil society from the UK, they were really better equipped and having the tools to be able to really then reach out to their MPs, to the government, to at different levels. And so I think my vision, or my determination in a way, would be that we can really, as faith-based movement, continue to educate ourselves and to really take on these voices, which have also been amazingly shared and expressed by several indigenous people's voices during the conference, and to be able to really, as you were saying, Vice, as well, to be able to step by step really it can't be step by step, but to really be able to switch the narrative in that way. So yeah, I think that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra. I was in a debriefing meeting with the Scottish civil society yesterday, and I was amazed to see that there was over 1,900 people that had been hosted by over 1,600 people from the civil society. So this kind of solidarity I find is also building a sense of family that brings a sense of justice and a sense of equality and fairness and help. And I think this is invisible in a sense in the negotiations, because you're so busy to negotiating with so many complex issues, with what you explained so wonderfully at the COP. But at the same time, I think we can see that country by country, we need to address the needs that are being visible in the countries where we go. So we were able to listen to the people from Scotland with their needs, with their fears. And as Alexandra was saying, through the Talanoa dialogue, we had the asks of the people who were participating into the call. So is there anything that you would both like to share on the COP27 in your vision, in next steps, next work to prepare for COP27? Maybe Vice, you could start, and then we leave the word to Alexandra. Sorry, Alexandra, and then we could have a moment of silence to finish together, if that's okay with all of you. So, Vice, please.
Thank you, Valerian, and thank you for those thoughts as well, Alexandra. And I think going towards COP27, if for faith-based organizations, if the focus is on justice, on climate justice, and creating a narrative of equity as a key foundational principle and outcome of the climate negotiations, then there are a couple of things that I would actually want to put forward. One is that this issue of climate justice and climate equity cannot be understood divorced from the impact of both what is happening now with respect to the climate, and what the impact of what is happening now with respect to the climate would be by mitigation measures and adaptation and loss and damage measures. By that I mean, when we talk about mitigation, for example, about emission reductions, we cannot focus the discussion at COP27 or COP28 or COP29 or COP30 or so on and so forth only on by how much should we reduce global or national emissions. That cannot be the sole conversation. It has to also be about, if we have to reduce by X number, by X percent, what are we supposed to have together with all of those other things in terms of energy access for the poor, in terms of transportation access for the poor and for communities, in terms of better houses, in terms of better education. So that kind of, if mitigation is a response measure to climate change, then what are the impacts that need to be looked at in order to make sure that the impacts of mitigation actions do not adversely affect vulnerable populations? That's one. Second, I think when we look at where we are now in terms of the fight against climate change, where we are now is a situation in which whatever we do on mitigation over the short and medium term will not affect, when I say short or medium term, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, will not affect the rise in temperatures. What it will do, what we will do in terms of mitigation now and over the next 10 years will affect temperature increases by lowering them over a time scale of 50 to 100 years. So that's 2, 3, 4 generations in the future. What that means then, if we talk about, again, climate justice and equity, we also then need to talk about what do we do for those generations that are currently living and will be alive in the near future. So that means those of us currently alive now and the poor amongst us, and those who will be alive in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And that means that we have to have a conversation at COP27 and COP28 and COP29 and so on and so forth about adaptation. And more importantly, I think increasingly also about loss and damage, because that is where this situation is driving us. And this situation, we are being driven into this situation where we have to talk more and more about adaptation and about loss and damage, largely because there were failures of implementation by developed countries in the past. What they agreed to in 1992, they did not do. And so what does that imply in terms of responsibilities to the present and future generations by those countries that did not do what they said they would do? And that has to be part of the conversation at COP27 and COP28 and moving forward, because it's about equity and justice. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Rice. Thank you so much for this contribution. And I remember one of our colleagues at the COP, and he was also always saying, adaptation is what we need to focus on. So you reminded me of him very greatly, very nicely. Thank you so much. Alexandra, can we hear your final thoughts, please?
Yes. So my final thoughts as a part of the interfaith community, I really feel that we need to continue increasing the community building, bringing our voices together, and also embodying what we want to see, which is to make sure that the places to speak and the voices are really given to the people who have a voice, but who are not being heard, so that we really bring that space as a placeholder for really the people who need to have their voice out there, so that through this community building, we can bring these powerful voices more and more towards COP27, focusing on at the national level and at the international level on several topics that Vice has also mentioned, but also from our end, I think really with this narrative of climate justice and focusing maybe, but not only on loss and damage, and on really looking at, as you said, the whole package, and on looking at also maybe really investment into oil and gas, and just like how do we bring just transition that will really include everyone, and also like looking out of COP, how do we develop an encompassing view that does not make us despair, but that really brings in biodiversity, harnessing all the other processes that are going to happen, and bringing either through the rights-based approach or in a way that really brings and establish accountability and the fact of taking responsibility for our action as the narrative, really, even as a value, really, to really establish this. So I think that and maybe just one brief mention, I think there was a question in the chat just about UNEA and how to engage, because it's coming. So biodiversity discussions are coming next year as well, and it might be really good to really have that very in mind, and also the UN Environmental Assembly. And just to mention that there is a coalition, an interfaith coalition there as well, as was mentioned a little bit by Amanda, but that's called Faith for Earth. And so if some people in the chat were interested, maybe they can look up via Faith for Earth and engage if they want. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for reminding us of Faith for the Earth. Also, as we have spoken so much, I think one word that I find comes up in my mind is transparency, because I think that this is one of the agenda that we need to move forward, because all the business and money-making treaties are not very transparent in terms of equality and in terms of bringing everyone on board. So let's have a moment of silence to finish our meeting. And thanks to both of you and Amanda, and sorry Eileen couldn't be there. Thank you, Vice, for your presence, and thank you, Alexandra. Bringing the focus of our attention on justice and love that is actually fueling justice. So thank you again and goodbye, and hope to meet with both of you soon. And thanks to all those who were with us and who asked us questions and participated. Bye.
Thank you, Valerian. Thank you very much.